So with that in mind, let me first introduce our what we're going to do is give each speaker, I'll give a short introduction, and then they'll have a 5 minutes or so to give their thoughts and impressions. They're all doing it chart-free as a favor to me. Thank you. And we'll go first to Alan. First we'll go to Preston, and then we'll go to Alan, and then to Ramesh. So let me start. Dr. Preston Marshall is a principal wireless architect for Google Wireless. He's responsible for spectrum access technology. He's been a primary motivator for the CBRS initiative. Congratulations, and thank you for that, among other efforts. He has been heavily involved in the wireless technology and policy, including the Deputy Director of Information Sciences Institute, ISI, is associated with USC, if I remember correctly. And also as a professor at USC's Electrical Engineering Department. He's a contributor to the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, PCAST, if you will, and helped contribute to a spectrum study that led to the CBRS band. He's also served as, and dearest to my heart, is he served as a program manager at DARPA, one of the world's great research funding organizations. He's also served as chair on the board of directors of the CBRS Alliance and chairs the Wireless Innovative Forum Spectrum Sharing Subcommittee. He also is an author of a recent book, Three-Tier Spectrum, Shared Infrastructure and a Path to 5G, which was released by Cambridge Press recently. And with that, welcome Preston, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dave. It's good to be speaking with a DARPA alumni. There aren't that many of us scattered around the community. So I want to talk a little bit about how we got where we did on spectrum sharing. There's a historical framework for today's event. So this is, as far as I know, the first major money that was put into spectrum sharing to really try to create field demonstrations that were evidence to change policy was the DARPA efforts that began around 2002. I went to DARPA actually to run them because I thought this was a really exciting opportunity for DARPA. And the focus there was to try to get policy buy-in, to get enough base that we could get policy community to really seriously consider spectrum sharing as an alternative to the traditional exclusive licensing and auctions. Good news is that it was relatively successful. In 2012, the Obama administration came out with the PCAST report that Dave mentioned, and that, coupled with an executive memo, said that it would be the policy of the administration to share spectrum rather than to reallocate it. So that was really when we transitioned from having to prove ourselves to becoming almost the de facto solution. And I think you see that the CBRS effort went on. When CBRS came out, industry pretty much aligned against it. I was at USC then, and Google was about the only company being at all helpful. Helped to have Eric Schmidt as study chair. But we now have seen in the PAL auction for CBRS that this is not sort of a toy for people to play with in their basement, like some of the operators might think about it. Wi-Fi. The PAL auction brought roughly $4.5 million. The estimates for CBRS or market value somewhere between $7 and $15 billion. Net consumer surplus somewhere between $80 and $260 billion. So, shared spectrum in this effort in one fell swoop moved from kind of an interesting toy, and FCC talked about it originally as an experiment. No, it's industrial grade. It's there. People are willing to put a lot of money even into shared bands where they don't have the traditional kinds of rights. And I think when Moesha went through her stuff, you could see that of the 4 big spectrum activities that are going on now, 3 of them are shared spectrum. CBRS, 6 gigahertz, the spectrum, something is happening below 355. No one knows exactly what, but something is happening there. And of course, C-band is the one outlier of traditional spectrum. So to some extent, we've arrived. There's a tendency, I think, in the research community to sort of fight over an answer of yes. We've answered the question. It is very good policy. It's very successful. And so we really need now to move to the next tier problem. It's time to stop writing papers about how wonderful shared spectrum is. We won. Sometimes it's more boring. Sometimes it's more fun to be arguing from below. And so now I think we've got to deal with what are the unique challenges that shared spectrum brings to us. And I think the last talk was good in introducing it. I chair the CBRS Alliance that is industrializing something that we started in the academic community. And I think our number one challenge in making a success out of this is the coexistence problem. Before, when the FCC allocated spectrum, they not only allocated it typically to one person, but very often, almost every time, to one use. It was mobile spectrum, it was fixed wireless spectrum. If we're going to make shareable spectrum work, we have to create coalitions of multiple types of users. So if you look at CBRS, you'll see that the bulk of the companies that are interested in it aren't thinking about mobility, they're thinking about private networks, SCADA, uplink dominated. We have Verizon, AT&T, who are interested in traditional mobility. We have IoT, and right now we have the largest number of boxes are fixed wireless for rural broadband. And we push them all into one band. So everyone worried about spectrum sharing between incumbents and sharing users, I would argue the really more important question is how do we share a band once we get it? When the FCC isn't telling people what to do with it. And I think that's really the challenge the community works. I think the last briefing talked about that. It could kill shared spectrum. If we can't play well with ourselves, then who is going to trust shared spectrum as a mechanism? There's one other attribute that I think the academic community needs to be thinking about. If you go back to the PCAST report, the advocate in the administration for PCAST was not the FCC, it wasn't broadband policy, it was the Council of Economic Advisors. It was the economists who wanted PCAST. And if you look at the PCAST report, which I'm sure doesn't focus at all well, it says to spur economic growth. And so the other thing we should be trying to do in spectrum is to provide spectrum to people who have innovative ideas, not necessarily just technical ideas. They could be new business models. They could be new ways of monetization. They could be new ways of providing services. Business models are as important as technical ones. They're all Shannon, we're pretty well there. But there's a lot of interesting ideas people have that are innovative in how to offer this. So, if you think about how does a spectrum system work with innovation, look at the internet. It was developed because people could try something out, experiment, fail fast. Alan's going to get up next. I'm sure Facebook has signs around that says fail fast. Nothing wrong with failing, just don't waste a lot of money. Now, in spectrum, you've got to pay billions of dollars to buy the spectrum. You've got to wait 8 years to move in. You've owned it perpetually. So how do we make spectrum so innovators can come in, have scalable entry, try something out, and grow it? So we should be thinking not only the technical impacts of what we're doing, which are important, but also about how are we bringing wireless into the same ecosystem that made Facebook, Google, Amazon so successful because they could develop and scale up rapidly. You can't do that in the spectrum model we have today. And we can't yet do it in shared spectrum. So there's two challenges there. One's technical and one's very, very, very business oriented. They're both important. Thanks.
Great. That was great, Press. Thank you for that. By the way, I remember when I was sitting in my DARPA office with Alan Adler, a former DARPA cohort, who's now at HRL, and Mark McHenry, and who started the company Shared Spectrum. And he was my program manager for Suo SAS. And we were kicking around one night, almost like drinking beer. We weren't drinking beer because it wasn't legal, but we were kicking around the office, just kicking some ideas around. And we talked about
could have been at carpools.
Yeah, that's right. We basically started kicking on this idea of could we operate our radio signals operating in the sidebands of other people's spectrum, just sort of sneaking in there. And that sort of led to the discussion about this whole idea of spectrum sharing. And Mark was just finishing up at that time. And so he left DARPA and then dived into this idea of spectrum sharing and was one of the champions.
I pumped a lot of money in his direction. He did much better outside than he did inside.
Yeah, no, he was a great PM, and I'm glad he did well on the outside. So now let me move to our next panelist. Alan Norman from Facebook is here. Alan joined Facebook's connectivity policy team in August and actively supports Facebook's connectivity initiatives. Alan is a longtime advocate for imposed broadband and internet improve broadband and internet access, shared infrastructure, spectrum for next generation technologies. Recently, Alan has been actively engaged in the rural access, Wi-Fi, millimeter wave, and 5G technologies. Alan holds a BS in mathematical sciences from Stanford University and an MS in management from Stanford's Graduate School of Business, where he was a Sloan Fellow. Welcome, Alan. The floor is
Dave,
yours.
thank you very much. And really pleasure to be here and appreciate your remarks, Prez and Monisha. Super relevant in my mind. So provide some context in terms of why Facebook's involved, why we care. Most Facebook users connect over wireless. So that means more than 2 billion people who use our services every day are connecting over a mobile device of some form. And the majority of those are over Wi-Fi. So the stakes are really high. It's something that we care about a lot. And we spend a lot of time thinking about how to improve connectivity, as well as develop new use cases. Augmented reality, virtual reality is one good example. And so 2 bands that we've been very active in and very interested in, I think are both very informative, are 6 gigahertz and 60. In the case of 6 gigahertz, we think it'll be fundamental to just improving overall connectivity as a complement to 5G, but also just making broadband in the home and in fixed use cases much more, give us, a roadmap for the next 10 to 15 years, at least. And in 60 gigahertz, we think it enables super low latency and different kind of connections that you couldn't do with the very large bandwidth that's available, but also might enable an alternative or a complement really to fiber in different ways and offering that. The sharing scenarios in 6 and 60 are really different and have presented all sorts of challenges for how we actually move forward and support working with regulatory authorities on what the regulation should be. Let me start with 60. So in 60, if you're a mobile device moving around, listen before talk makes a lot of sense. It's been proven out in Wi-Fi, and that's what people are using and seems to work. There are definitely issues like how do radars versus communications device work together. We haven't figured that out yet. There's a lot of work there. But then in the fixed outdoor environment, listen before talk doesn't make a lot of sense or doesn't prove to be effective. In our tests, it's shown, in fact, to reduce overall throughput rather than improve it and not help sharing. And the reason is you have phased arrays with narrow beams being steered, and they don't see each other. And it turns out that what's far more effective is to encourage the equipment manufacturers to have even higher gain, narrower beams, so there's less likely to have interference, and reduce the power and use transmit power control. And so we've done studies around that. And that's generally where things are moving. The FCC basically says, industry, you figure it out. But elsewhere, for example, in Europe, that's where the regulations through ETSI are now landing. And in fact, in this case, the 3GPP and IEEE communities are working together to come up with a common set of rules around that. But it hasn't been easy, and one of the things would be great from to get help from academia here is what are some of the underlying studies and metrics that can be used to characterize this, so that it's hard if you're a regulator. Do I trust industry? Or are they just representing their interests, or is it is it a balanced study? And some of these things are much better to come from academia, working together with everybody, because most of it is really factual by the time you're done in terms of working through it. In 6 gigahertz, the challenges are different there. There's the fixed example, which Monisha mentioned, for high power fixed outdoor access points, sharing with fixed links. And there it looks very much like the traditional relatively static analysis that you might do, looking at propagation loss, antenna gain, mismatch, all the various characteristics, and you come up with what the anticipated interference might be, and you figure out what the harm threshold is. You do that. But if you move to a mobile example where people are moving around, where the devices aren't always in the same orientation, where power changes, where the use activity factors change, and so on. What are the tools that you can use to measure that? Well, we're working through that now with the FCC. I don't want to go into great detail. That wouldn't be appropriate. But what I would say is this is, I think, a rich area for academia to look at and consider what are some of the common metrics that we can use to really understand what the risks are in doing that. And I think that would be very helpful, because I would say there's a lot of learning on the fly, and that's just challenging for everybody. I'll leave it at that, Dave, and maybe, and
Great, Alan. Thank you.
Some questions. Thank you.
And I'll give you an idea. So if I have phased arrays, I can spoil the beam. And so I could actually broadcast sort of an isotropic or, quadrant wise message for people to sync up on. That'd be 100% probability of intercept. And then I could go to my high gain beams. And so you might be able to intermix low gain, high gain with an active array quite simply, actually. So anyway. So let's see. Our next speaker is Ramesh Rao. He's a fellow faculty member here at UCSD. He's the director of the Qualcomm Institute. He's led that since 2001. He holds the Qualcomm Endowed Chair in Telecommunication and Information Technologies from the Jacobs School of Engineering. He's also a member of the school's Electrical and Computer Engineering Department. Dr. Rao is an IEEE Fellow and Senior Fellow at the California Council on Science and Technology. Dr. Rao earned his PhD in electrical engineering from the University of Maryland, College Park in 1984. After receiving his MS from the same institution in 1982, he's earned his bachelorate degree in 1980 from the University of Madras. So welcome, Dr. Rao.
Thank you, Dave. I will be quick so we have some time for conversations. What makes this an especially opportune conversation for us, for many of us, is that we are deeply involved in responding to NSF's call that perhaps Monisha had something to do with on spectrum innovation institutes, I suppose. And what this initiative is asking us to do is to reach across a bunch of established users of spectrum, the radar folks, navigation folks, radio astronomers, as well as commercial wireless, and try to come up with new mechanisms that would enable better and more effective use of the spectrum. So we've just launched a series of conversations, and although it's early in the day, it's quite clear that these communities have their own long history, and they have evolved to sort of agree on a certain way of thinking, certain way of posing problems and coming up with solutions. And they live in their own worlds. They all want to preserve their way of life. We heard the radar folks talk about it. We heard the FAA talk about it. We hear the DoD folks talk about it. And it's a humbling thing as a researcher to recognize that one community's innovation is actually viewed as a threat by another community. So as a researcher, you think you are on to something new. You think people will be excited. Quite the opposite. So let me give you an example that actually came up. As we move to these higher frequencies, the network, the notion of a network itself as a sensor, you might be able to estimate using measurements of RF signals that you're anyway exchanging water vapor in the atmosphere. That's the business that the radar folks are in. And so how do they see you? Well, to some extent, they see it as a threat. The case that they can make for further deployment of their units will be impacted perhaps adversely. Another one that's a little bit out there, I couldn't believe it when I read the paper, but I've seen 3 works by now that reproduce this, that you can estimate ambient temperature on a very fine grain down to about 1 degree centigrade by just looking at the battery capacity in people's handsets. The rate at which the battery discharges is a function of the ambient temperature. And if you have enough data, that's a pretty good sensor of what the ambient temperature is in that city. You don't need to deploy anything else. So because you have new methods like machine learning and large-scale data access, you can pull these things off, but it isn't always received well. So if I might try to abstract this, what we have is a competing system of, as Monisha and Preston mentioned, heterogeneous systems that are developing, right? There is nobody in charge, and they're all trying to figure out how to feed around this trough. So why would they change their ways? So I'm going to rhetorically come up with 3 possible reasons. The first one is, if you commit to a grand problem, the proverbial moonshot, you just undertake to do something, you let go of all your old constraints and you say, I'm going to apply every idea I know and borrow things from everybody else to address it. The second one is if you have a common threat, you're all afraid of something. Maybe that's RF interference in this case. And so you borrow the best methods from every other community and take advantage of that. There's a third one, which is money. I think if there is money to be made, maybe that helps move things around, which I think ultimately comes down to incentive and mechanism design. Shared spectrum is a good example, and incentivizing people who behave well and create more efficient use would be a refinement. But in many ways, mechanism design is not exactly a wireless problem. So how do wireless researchers, the kinds that we have hundreds of graduate students conducting research in, contribute to this larger realignment of this ecosystem? I think that's one of the bigger challenges. I think we need to perhaps get comfortable working with these larger socio-technical systems. But this is not a solution, but I just want to sort of put it out there that there are probably 1,000 dissertations written every year on wireless. And if the industry really recognizes this sort of free creative labor and figures out a way to harness it, there's this enormous paid for by somebody else source of sort of new ideas. But what gets students going on this is access to data, access to the actual control knobs, access to accurate measurements. And some communities are very open to this and they benefit from this enormous creative force, and others run walled gardens and you have no way of ever going in and looking to see if your ideas are actually going to make a difference. So I think at some economic level, I think if commercial providers open up more of their systems so that researchers, by that I mean graduate students working on dissertations, can actually try out their ideas, I think a great deal of progress could be made. So you'd have hundreds of small experiments which might inform the new policy making that needs to take place so that we'll have better systems.
Great,
If I may just follow up to what Ramesh just said, the last point, and that is actually exactly what we realized that we can do today with the phones that we have, right? So we are all used to our phones gathering a lot of data on websites that we are going to, what we are clicking on, what news items we are watching. All of that data is aggregated. But there is a lot of data on the wireless networks that we are connected to on our phones too. And I think, yes, and when I was at NSF, I would try this a lot with commercial companies, trying to get access to data, and it is going to be always a very hard process. So I think as an academic community, we can turn the problem around and ask us, okay, what can we do to gather the data ourselves? Can we use different kinds of tools and make it easier for people to start gathering their own data and making it available to everybody else?
Livermore did some experiments on could they use cell phones for radiation detectors.
You could.
And so you could actually be able to actually sense radiation levels in an environment on a city scale kind of thing. Very, very clever use. So, hey, so let's see. We have 15 minutes or so for some questions. Actually, 13 minutes. And I'm looking for some questions, hopefully that come from the audience in the chat. And while we're waiting for those to come in, hint, hint, hint. Let me tee up a couple of questions here that I thought occurred to me. So Manisha, do you know, as part of the FCC, what's the anticipated total financial raise that will happen from auctioning all the spectrum that's planned to be auctioned? Is there an internal estimate of how much this will yield? I think press hinted at or came up with some numbers, but just curious, is there an FCC estimate in the works?
If you go to the auction websites, they will tell you whatever is publicly available, as Preston and I mentioned too, for CBRS, which is just 100 megahertz of spectrum that some people think is very encumbered. That still raised $4.5 billion in auction fees. So I think the potential for raising that money is pretty high. But again, from the FCC's perspective or the government's perspective, it's more the reverse as to what is the economic benefit that can be unleashed on the community by the use of the
the country.
spectrum,
Yes.
the country. And those kind of, for every proceeding we do, there is an economic analysis that gets done as to, because especially when you're talking about shared spectrum or you're talking about moving satellites out and letting 5G in, there is always a cost benefit analysis that gets done. And I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, but we do that in every proceeding we look at.
Yeah, I remember DOD, as part of one of the DSB studies I did, the DOD was actually offered financial reimbursements if they had to move some of their spectrum. So you could actually file to get some of the auction funding back into your agency to pay for it.
And that's how the National Spectrum Consortium, I think a lot of the funding for that is coming from there, that the DOD is going to get money from a lot of the spectrum that they use that's going to be auctioned. And so some of that money is being put back into the research, into spectrum sharing, into how can you actually share spectrum better. The other thing I just wanted to mention, again, picking up on what Ramesh said is, and I don't want this to come off as a criticism of the academic community, but even when I was at NSF, I used to constantly send out reminders to the academic community. These NPRMs that FCC puts out are a minefield of research problems. But academics are not looking there, right? They're looking at the research, the standard venues of your conferences and your journals and the places you always go to do research to find the new research problems. As Alan mentioned, 6 gigahertz, it's a minefield of research problems there that I don't think too many academics are looking at. So I think there has to be a little bit more of the communities coming together, of the wireless research community also moving out of the comfort zone and looking for where the really challenging problems are, as well as industry and government recognizing the contributions that are being made by the academic community to solve some of these problems.
Dave, can I comment on that one for a second?
Yeah, please press.
When I was one of we created the Dice Band conference to try to bring industry and everyone together. And one of the interesting things was, I think it was the 3rd Dice Band conference I chaired, that when I looked, the TPC rejected all the papers from industry. And you calling my chairman up and what gives? Why these are great papers? Well, everyone knows shared spectrum is for unlicensed. And you will find relatively little academic work that goes and talks to Verizon, and everyone does Wi-Fi. People do Wi-Fi experiments and draw conclusions about wireless based upon the very unique characteristics of Wi-Fi. And there isn't this outreach into the fact that most of us are living our lives on a variety of things. But because Wi-Fi is so easy to set up and is so approachable, it's really sucked the oxygen out of looking at broader and more general problems in the academic community, which means we end up having to invest in them. And it's no one in industry wants to do the kind of long-term work that an academic can do.
The basic studies. Yeah. Actually, we got a question that asked. Oh, yes, go ahead, Al.
2 quick comments, if I may, and then move on to the next question. I just wanted to point out on 5.9 gigahertz and 6 gigahertz, there's a very good study done by Dr. Roel Katz. It's available at Wi-Fi Forward, looking at the economic value of those 2 bands. And it was 184 billion, or 183, rounding up a little bit, were the numbers that he came up with. So, there's a lot at stake, and that's not about auction revenue.
Yeah, good.
I understand. Second thing.
Okay, sorry.
Just building on top of what Monisha said, and just specific to 6 gigahertz. One of the things that industry did was a study on body loss, working with the Wireless Research Center of North Carolina to understand both link loss on body between 2 devices, but also to the far field. We looked around all over to see what was available. We did not want to do that ourselves. That was something that we had to then commission and get done. And I'm sure it's incomplete. There's a lot more that could be done. But just understanding those things and really knowing all the nuances and so on, I think that's a rich area. Maybe Monisha can add some more there. But, it would be great if there was a much deeper body of knowledge on those topics, because it's essential to understanding some of the sharing issues and coexistence.
Well, maybe that's something the Spectrum Innovation Initiative Center that Monisha conceptualized might take as part of its charter. So that's.
Yeah, I left NSF before it came to fruition, but these were ideas that at NSF we would discuss internally among all the program managers all the time as to how do we do this better.
Yeah, no, I think someone has to be looking after it. All too often, it seemed like the agency got caught, the other agents like NOAA got caught sort of flat-footed on some of the Spectrum's challenges that were interfering and stuff like that. So the government getting out in front of that seems like a good idea. Ramesh had a good question for Alan. So Ramesh, let me just ask you to ask your question of Alan direct.
Yes, Alan, you mentioned that 60% of the users were coming in over Wi-Fi. Was that for America, or is that true globally? And is there any conclusion you can draw on what sort of infrastructure people are able to rely on?
So at least 60. In fact, I think it's far more, and that's globally. Yeah, the vast majority of people that connect over Facebook do it over Wi-Fi. Now, that doesn't mean that there isn't a cellular link in between, or there isn't, a broadband, to your home or to your office. But the actual device, that last hop is the majority is Wi-Fi. And why? It's simple. It's widely available. It's inexpensive. It's ubiquitous. So in the home, the office, and it's gotten to the point where it's reliable enough that we can have conferences like this where we're using it. And so, yeah, right.
So I was going to say, it's interesting. Viasat. Their business model is the satellite links to the Earth to a Wi-Fi, I'll say, concentrator, and that in the little village in Africa is a Wi-Fi node that everyone's tied into with their low-cost cell phones, and then they use Viasat to feed it out, and apparently that's working gangbusters for them. Yeah. Much more traffic than they ever anticipated.
Yeah. So, but Ramesh, what I want to be clear is, as Preston points out, it's not just about Wi-Fi. You need those other connections too. So our view is we really need to support in a balanced way all the different approaches and making sure you get out there and so people have choice, alternative competition. But I would say just because of the simplicity and the low cost of Wi-Fi, it is foundational, right?
So we got a question from one of the audience. So I want to make sure we get to that, to be fair. So basically the person asked, he says, can't an entity just partner with a wireless carrier to obtain anonymous, basically, data, anatomized data to use for studies and research purposes? Why is this so difficult? And maybe Monisha, I think, or Press, one of the two, you could take that.
So yeah, I can address this a little bit. There are, and I think there are a lot of universities that have research, contracts with a particular carrier to get data, and the problem there is, so they do this analysis, they write up this paper, and they publish it, and they publish the results and not the data, and so it's never independently verifiable. But that is one of the hallmarks of what we do as an academic community, right? That somebody should be able to reproduce what you just did. But if the underlying data is never released, it's very hard to do that. Yes. That is the problem, yeah.
It is hard to anonymize. Even within our company, we don't share cellular performance data because, I know where someone lives. The phone, I don't know who you are, but I know where the phone spends at night. And so it's really hard to make this non-exploitable. That's why, we saw things that came out with NSA grabbing some of this data, because even anonymized, it has a lot of meaning. And clearly right now, the message around the world, particularly in Europe, is privacy is a driving consideration. So I think it's going to be harder and harder for industry to offer that. Things like open signal that people opt into. And I noticed we should use some open signal data there. I mean, that's great.
Actually, I didn't. I just used the results. We are gathering our own data precisely for that reason. We've just buckled down and said, okay, we're going to go out there and grab our own data because it's so difficult to come by it.
And operators don't want, when you look at the data, you do see that some of the carriers are not as good as some of the others, and they're not terribly interested in sharing that. I think Anisha's right. This is something the academic community has to take on. You have lots of handsets. You can crowdsource a lot of this stuff without having industry have to deal with all the opt-ins and lawyers. You've seen what your user agreement looks like these days.
Unreadable. Hey,
Yeah.
another question for the audience. Maybe this will be our last question, depending on your guys' answers. So, question is, what is driving the lack of interest on 7 to 24 gigahertz spectrum? Given the recent C-band and DSS success, could we have better networks at 10G or 15G or 28G? I'll note that I think in the 5G spectrum planning, I thought the UK was actually looking at X-band as one of its bands of potential use. And I know in the US, the military seems to want to keep that for themselves.
Yeah, and that's basically the problem. It's not that there is no interest in it. The problem is trying to figure out how you do this, because you either have to move out services that are in that band, or you got to figure out sharing mechanisms.
So
But-
in the name of national defense, we're protecting the spectrum.
Another spin on that might be, you can look at upper frequencies if you put in lots of fiber recently. So parts, particularly in Asia, where they built out recently and they put lots of fiber, the frequencies above 10 gig make a lot of sense. If you're like United States, where we have relatively poor fiber pushed out, then it really pushes you down to low band. The problem with millimeter wave isn't just that millimeter wave doesn't go far. It doesn't go far. If you have fiber to it, it's not a problem.
Right.
If your fiber is 5 kilometers from where people are, then you are forced into the mid-band. So some of what people think is spectrum policy in America really is driven by how our fiber got built and sort of the age of the telecom. We had better wires, so the other guys ended up with better fiber. And
Yep.
so you can't, when you think about these upper frequencies, you can't separate wireless and wired, because no point having lots of wireless if you don't have the fiber to it. And I think that's really what's behind people, although we don't talk about it that way.
Another
Yeah,
legacy.
and that's the stumbling block for things like rural connectivity, is you don't have the backhaul. And the good thing about millimeter wave, though, is that you can do, there is integrated backhaul and service. So you can use the millimeter wave, and there are innovative ways of doing mesh backhaul using millimeter wave. But it's not as easy in terms of technology as laying fiber. But in this country, laying fiber is very expensive. So that's always been limited.
Yep. So any final concluding comments before we wrap the session? I think they've asked us to bring it to a close. So I'll just give you guys one last chance. Any closing thoughts? All right. I think we have a quorum for dismissal. Thank you, guys. I really appreciate your time. We enjoyed the discussions, and thank you for the audience for tuning in.
Thank you.
Back over to the session chairs.
Thank you, everyone.